Hi, and welcome to another All Nation Line video. I'm John Webble, and today we're here to talk about this particular sprocket and its usefulness in repairing your All Nation chain drive transmissions. But to review, you may recall, if you know the history of All Nations, the tower drives that used to power the F units or even the switchers were geared. Originally they were just involute gears, and then later they came out with the helix gears, and then in more recent years they would replace these helix with sprockets for a chain drive. Those sprockets years ago were from Servolink originally, I believe, and were either nylon or Delrin plastic, and they worked pretty well. They simply were in place of what you would typically find where the helix gears were. They would press fit these onto the drive shafts. The trouble with these after so many years is they deteriorated and the plastic would crack up and the drive shaft would spin in the sprocket and your locomotive was absolutely useless. It wouldn't run down the tracks because of that particular malfunction. A typical implementation of the chain drive would look very similar to this, which I would put, say, in an F unit. It's a little taller tower. The sprockets top and bottom are the same number of teeth, so it's a 1-to-1 on this particular drive. This particular All Nation mechanism was my grandfather's, and it was originally a chain drive and had sat in the box for years and years due to the fact that it was fairly difficult to repair it or replace the old sprockets that deteriorated. So I'm going to show in this video how easy it is to upgrade and get your engine running again using these two sprockets here, which I've used on each of the towers to get this engine back on the tracks and running again. So let's have a first-hand look at the problem surrounding the reason why these would be fairly difficult to repair. And you will note that the way these transmissions were constructed in the past, the spacer bushings, number 4040s, were peened over or riveted to the metal sides of the gearbox. So if you want to do any kind of maintenance on this, you'd have to really shear these, cut these off to be able to take it apart, so you're fairly going to destroy your spacer bushings, and their usability may not be that good. Now, on the other hand, on a highly used mechanism that's been running for 30 or 40 years, these bushings may have some wear and tear on them, so they might need to be replaced. But in the case of this locomotive, the gearing and the bushings are in good condition. The only trouble with this is the sprockets. And the solution that we came up with to make this an easy fix and a low-cost fix, other than the amount of time you would spend to take the mechanism apart and put it back together, so the problem with the old drives is if you didn't want to try to take this all apart and hopefully get it back together with the right parts, and in the case of this engine, we really don't have to do that. All we need to do is replace the top sprocket on the top shaft and the bottom sprocket. And I'll show you what the initial problem is with doing that. So when All Nations originally came out with the sprocket drive, they would have several parts involved in its assembly, and they would have just a plain ordinary socket with a very minimal hub, and this split shaft, which you may be familiar with, part number 4041, would have the sprocket pressed onto the knurl. There's a knurl surface on that, and then they would press the drive shaft into the split coupler, or vice versa. They put the shaft in first and then slip the sprocket on. But you can't do that in this configuration. So what we did is we took our sprocket that we 3D print in polycarbonate and we modified the hub. So now all you need to do is drop the tower, take this and slip it over the shaft all the way down, making sure it aligns with the top one, and put a little CA glue on it, and you're good to go. Now, typically what I'll do is I'll put a little set screw in there too, just to make sure it doesn't shaft doesn't turn inside the sprocket, but it's a pretty tight fit, and that's an easy way to go about fixing these tower drives without taking them all apart. On the top one, it's very straightforward. You take the C-clip out, the shaft comes out of the spacer bushings, and I highly recommend that you degrease these before you put the sprockets on. And then you simply have to put the chain back on your sprockets and reassemble your truck and install it back on the chassis. When I glue these on with a little CA glue and press them on, typically while the glue is still wet, especially around the outside surface, I'll sprinkle a little baking soda on it, and it hardens up right away and gives a pretty good joint. And so when you press fit the top sprocket, it's also being press fit onto a knurled surface, so it's a good tight fit, and this polycarbonate probably won't crack up and deteriorate like the old Delrin plastic. So here is one of the tower drives, and you can see on the bottom sprocket it's definitely cracked at the tooth. The shaft is spinning in that, and it has to come off, and it will probably fall off on its own. As you can see, if one sprocket has got a problem, the other one also does too. There's a crack in it, right, if you can look right at the top. And so we'll go ahead, remove these, and degrease this before we go ahead and put on the new sprockets. So as you can see, we took off the top drive shaft. There's a little C-clip that holds it on. There's also a shimmering between the backside of the sprocket and the spacer bushing. So this came out like that. You'll note how brittle the old sprocket is, just fell apart. So that's where we're at. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to degrease this and then reassemble it. Okay, so now I degreased these parts, and what I like to do after I degrease them and get them nice and washed is blow dry them with hot air to get any moisture that is left over from degreasing them with a detergent, and that works really well. Now, the thing I like to do before installing these parts on the shaft, and I will note that the upper one has 12 teeth, the lower one has 16, which is the replacement for what was on there originally. I generally like to take these 3D printed parts and with a little triangle file touch up the teeth and soften the edges a little bit, because the 3D printer prints pretty accurately compared to an injection molded plastic one, which the teeth are already somewhat not very sharp. These are very sharp, and that gives you an opportunity to make it so that your chain will run nice and smooth on these teeth. And I just generally go like this, very briefly around them, take any tooth off, and then do around the edges on both sides, and we're ready to then install these by press fitting these onto the shaft. So you don't have to disassemble any of this. Normally people think, well, I got to take this off in order to press the sprocket from this direction, and in this case, with this hub modification, you don't need to do that. So this will not interfere with the other shaft coming in here from your other axle as well. The one thing you want to do is make sure once these are installed that they're in perfect alignment for your chain. And sometimes you'll put the shimmering on this side and install it, and other times you can put this in, put the shimmering there, and then put the clip on, and it gives you a little bit of play to get your alignment perfect. Okay, so I touched up the teeth on these, and really what you want to do first is to test where your alignment is going to be. And you have a little more flexibility on the top one because, like I say, you could put your shimmering on either side of this 40-40 spacer bushing. And you also have this hub extension, and typically I found in most cases it's going to go on press fit in that direction so that your hub is facing your spacer bushing. However, you could turn it around and put it on this way. And when you press fit these on, you want to make sure the face is perfectly up against this shoulder on this shaft. And you will best try to put some pressure on that and then check it before your CA sets. And typically what I'll do is put this on, and then once it's on, I'll put a little bead around here of the CA and then stick it in the baking soda, and it instantly gives a great bond. So that's the first thing. So what we're going to do here is take and slide this lower sprocket onto this, and this shoulder will go inside the hub. And typically I made it tight so that it is more or less a press fit. Even if you didn't glue or pin it, it's still gonna be pretty snug to the shaft. So I'm gonna press this all the way down, and if it's too darn tight, okay, I might put it on the bench and give it a little tap, but I want to make sure that once it's on there, there's no wobble as it turns. And so initially I'm going to press it on that far, and then I'm going to come along and put this one on temporarily. I'm not going to put any glue or anything on it. See, that's pretty tight, and it won't crack. This polycarbonate is pretty tough stuff, and I want it to be a tight fit. So let me put this in a vise and tap it on there, and we'll be right back. Okay, that was real easy. If these are a little too tight, you can just take a very, very fine file and make sure there's no burr inside the hub before you press it on. And as you can see, I've got it pretty well flat up against the face. So now I'm ready to stick it back in here and actually see where my alignment is ending up. And if I push it all the way in, it's not lining up, and I rather expect that. And if it's not lining up, that means one of two things. Either you have to adjust your top sprocket in and out a little bit, or you have to press this one on the bottom a little further onto the shaft. And that can be done by taking a short piece of tubing and putting it on this shoulder and tapping it gently so that you don't go too far. But in reality, the shoulder, once it hits inside there, it will not go any further. So typically what I'll do is I know that if I put the spacer or the shimmering on here first, that's probably not going to give me the alignment I need. So I'll typically stick it in there, put the shimmering on. Then I'll go ahead and, just for testing purposes, put the C-clip back on to get an idea of where. Easier said than done with big fingers. But initially this shimmering can block your access to the shaft. And really what I need is a long nose pair of pliers to stick that on. All right, let's see how handy I am with this. So I got the washer down flat. I got the pliers to get me started here. And it's going to feel a little bit on the tight side because this clip just flew off. That always happens with these C-clips once in a while. They're as bad as a spring. They can go flying on you if you don't keep them under control. But anyway, I did stick it back on there. And because the shimmering is between the spacer bushing and the C-clip, it's going to hold this out. Whoops. And as you can see, it moved the top one out almost enough. So I'm going to tap this one in a little bit. Once I know where my alignments are, then I can set these permanent. So the first one I did, I put a bead of CA glue around there. And as you can see, it looks a little bit white because I then stuck it into the baking soda. And I'll let that set for a minute before I clean this up. And there'll be a nice little seam all around here, as well as having pressed this onto the knurl. The CA glue will definitely hold this sprocket on the shaft without the shaft turning in the sprocket. Okay, now we're going to do the bottom sprocket. And on these 3D prints, I always try to make sure there's no thread inside the hub. I usually will take a pair of pliers to hold it, but I'd use a little X-Acto just to cut those threads out that could block this when you go to put it on. But that's an artifact of 3D printing. It's not a issue in this case, but you do want to make sure that the face of the hub is clean, nothing blocking it, so when you put it on, you'll get the right adjustment and alignment. So now I'm ready to put my lower sprocket on. What I'm going to do is put a bead of CA on this shoulder here. Note that this will not be gripping the knurl. So that's one reason why I tried to make this particular sprocket part a press fit, and I will drill an 090 and pin this or use a set screw. And that will assure me that this shaft will not turn inside this sprocket. So this basically concludes this little tutorial on changing out the sprockets. But one last comment. Sometimes fellas have a difficulty getting the tension on the link chain drive, and you can adjust the length sometimes by removing or adding a link. But in our case, I tried to get the correct tension on these because neither shaft is adjustable up or down. And the way I do this is go back into the CAD software and calibrate the metrics on either one of the sprockets. On these two, they're pretty standard. And you don't want too much tension, and you don't want a chain that's too loose either. So this one works pretty darn good. It's a little stiff. This needs oiling, and I think it's ready to go.